The air was heavy with the scent of things dying and things being born. It was a smell of frangipani blossoms, their sweet perfume, a thick blanket in the heat, and underneath it, the wet, dark smell of soil turning to mud after a brief, violent shower. The combination settled at the back of my throat, a taste of cloying sweetness and rich decay. Stanley called it the scent of adventure. I thought it smelled like an open grave. A low, ceaseless hum vibrated through the soles of my shoes, the sound of a million insects singing in the trees. The heat was a living thing, wrapping around me, making the fabric of my blouse stick to my skin. I pushed my glasses up the bridge of my nose, a habit he always teased me for. The plastic was slick with sweat, blurring the world for a moment before it settled back into sharp, unforgiving focus. He was standing at the edge of the village path, where the packed dirt gave way to a tangle of green that swallowed the light. The jungle wasn't just a collection of trees, it was a solid wall, pulsing with unseen life. He pointed with his chin towards a break in the trees, a barely there trail marked by a single, faded red ribbon tied to a branch. The ribbon, bleached by the sun, fluttered weakly in the still air. Stanley said, his voice bright with a collector's thrill, "That's the one! The path to Watsem!" The old temple. The hum of the cicadas seemed to grow louder, a shrill, piercing buzz that vibrated behind my eyeballs. My own voice felt small against it, a fragile human sound. I said, "The man at the guest house said it was forbidden." A cold knot formed in my stomach, a strange and unwelcome feeling in the crushing warmth of the afternoon. It started as a sudden coolness on the surface of my skin, as if a refrigerated door had opened and closed in the space of a heartbeat. Then the coldness pushed inward, past the muscle, a sharp, invasive chill that settled deep in my gut. It felt like I had swallowed a handful of ice, a solid weight of dread that made the humid air feel thin and unbreathable. My body reacted before my mind could, a slight, involuntary shiver that rippled up my spine. He laughed, a booming sound that startled a flock of small, iridescent birds from a nearby tree. The sudden explosion of wings was a frantic, percussive sound that made my shoulders jump towards my ears. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. Stanley said, "That's how you know it's worth seeing, Janet. Forbidden is just a word for unspoiled. We didn't come all this way to Thailand to stay on the tourist trail." He adjusted the strap of his camera bag, the worn leather creaking in the quiet. "I'll be back before dinner. Don't you worry your pretty head." He leaned in and kissed my cheek. His skin was hot and dry, smelling of sun and salt and the faint, dusty scent of his camera bag. "Don't wait up." He turned and walked towards the tree line, his white shirt a stark and disappearing flag against the deep green. I stood there, one hand coming up to my neck to touch the small silver locket I always wore. It was cool against my skin, a satisfying weight. The metal was old, a gift from my mother who got it from hers, a link in a chain. My thumb found the familiar worn spot on its face, a small depression in the intricate floral engraving where generations of fingers had rested. The silver was tarnished in the deep grooves of the tiny roses, a darkness that made the polished surfaces seem brighter. It felt solid, a piece of home in this overwhelmingly foreign place. I watched until the jungle had taken him completely, the green closing in behind him as if he had never been there at all. I stood in that spot long after he was gone. The hand that had been touching my locket dropped to my side, but the other one was clenched into a fist, my short nails digging into the soft flesh of my palm. The tiny, sharp pains were a focus. In the silence left by his departure, the jungle sounds rushed back in, louder than before. The cicada's shrill song was no longer a background hum, but a deafening, pulsating wall of noise. Underneath it, I could hear the wet dripping of water from broad leaves, the rustle of something small in the undergrowth, the distant caw of a bird. The air, thick with its perfume of flowers and rot, had a strange metallic taste to it now, like the air after a lightning strike. I took one slow breath, then another, before turning my back on the path. The days that followed were made of waiting. At first, it was an easy, patient sort of waiting. Stanley was a man who operated on his own schedule. He would get lost in his explorations, chasing a photograph, and forget the time. I spent the first day reading on the small veranda of our bungalow. The sun felt warm and benevolent on my arms, a gentle, sleepy heat. The wicker chair creaked a comforting rhythm under my weight, a sound that mixed with the distant, gentle chatter from the village and the buzz of a lone fat bee investigating the hibiscus flowers bordering the porch. Everything felt right, normal. This was the quiet part of the adventure, the part where I rested while he explored. I trusted him. I trusted his experience. The warmth on my skin was a reassurance, a physical promise that all was well. I read my book, the pages growing soft and slightly damp in the humid air. The story was a simple romance, predictable and sweet. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, a small tremor of unease started in my hands, making them tremble just enough to blur the words on the page. My first thought was a spike of pure fear. He was hurt! He was lost in the dark! My mind produced a vivid image of him, fallen, his camera broken beside him. But that thought was too sharp, too painful. It couldn't be true. Stanley was careful. He was a professional, not some reckless teenager. My second thought was annoyance. He was being inconsiderate again, lost in his own world, with no thought for me waiting here. He knew how I worried. But that felt wrong too. He was rarely truly thoughtless. The final, comforting explanation settled over me. He had found something incredible. The ruins of the temple were more magnificent than he imagined, and he was waiting for the moon to rise to get the perfect shot. He was an artist, and artists have their own clocks. He had told me not to worry. This was me, not worrying. I went inside and made a pot of tea, leaving a cup out for him. It grew cold on the table. After I finally went to bed, I left his cup on the small table on the veranda. I sat on the edge of our bed, the room dark except for the thin sliver of moonlight under the door. My hands lay limp in my lap, my fingers tracing the patterns on the bedspread. In the silence between my own anxious breaths, the night came alive. A gecko chirped on the wall, a sharp clicking sound. Far away! A dog barked, a lonely echoing call. From the jungle came a chorus of sounds so dense and layered it was impossible to pick out any one thing. The air tasted of wood smoke and the faint, sweet scent of the cold tea sitting just outside the door. I stayed like that for a long time, just a still shape in a dark room, listening. The next day, I decided to walk into the village market. I needed to do something, to feel the world moving around me, to shake off the stillness of the bungalow. The market was a cacophony of sound and smell. Chickens squawked in wooden cages. The sharp, rhythmic chop of a cleaver against a wooden block rang out from a butcher's stall. Vendors called out in a language that was beautiful and impenetrable, their voices rising and falling like music. The air was rich with the scent of a dozen competing spices, the smoky char of grilled meat, the sharp tang of chili and lime, and the sweet, cloying scent of overripe mangoes. The heat was magnified here, radiating up from the packed earth and shimmering above the corrugated tin roofs of the stalls. It felt alive, vibrant. But as I moved through the crowd, a strange quiet fell around me. It was like walking through water, a sudden pressure muffling the world. Conversations would falter as I approached. A woman selling jasmine garlands, her hands a blur of fragrant motion, suddenly froze when she saw me, her eyes widening over the white blossoms. Her hands, which had been so quick, became still and awkward in her lap. A man haggling over glistening, silver-skinned fish turned, his mouth still open from his last word, and simply stared. The sound of his argument died in his throat. "People didn't just look at me," they recoiled. A small child, toddling near a fruit stand, pointed a chubby finger at me, and his mother snatched him up, her movements quick and panicked. She hid his face in her shoulder as she hurried away, casting a frightened look back at me. My heart began to beat a low, heavy drum against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, a chilling dampness in the sweltering heat. My body wanted to shrink, to become smaller, to apologize for its own existence. I tried to smile, to show I was harmless, just a tourist admiring the local color. But my smile felt like a mask, a stiff, painful stretching of unfamiliar muscles. I told myself it was nothing. Of course it was nothing. My first thought, hot and immediate, was that they knew something. They knew Stanley was gone, and they were looking at me with accusation. But that was my own guilt, my own fear, painting their faces. My second thought was that I had committed some grave social error. My dress was too plain or too foreign. I had looked someone in the eye for too long. I was a walking cultural mistake. But the reaction was not anger or offense. It was fear, pure, unadorned fear. Why would they be afraid of me? That made no sense at all. The final, most logical conclusion was the one I clung to. I was a stranger here, a tall, pale woman in a place where I was the anomaly. I was alone, and my husband, who had been with me before, was not. My presence was a question mark, a disruption to their tightly knit community. Their caution was not a judgment on me, but a natural protective response to the unknown. I bought a small bag of lychees from a vendor who would not meet my eyes and hurried back to the bungalow, the feeling of being watched, a physical weight on my shoulders. The humid air seemed to turn frigid just for me. Back on the veranda, the world seemed to steady itself. The sun was warm, the air thick with the scent of flowers. The market, with its strange, silent rejection, felt a world away. I sat in my wicker chair and peeled one of the lychees. The rough, bumpy skin gave way to the pale, translucent fruit beneath. I put it in my mouth. The sweetness was explosive, a burst of floral, perfumed juice that was instantly grounding. It was just a piece of fruit, a simple, perfect thing. I closed my eyes and focused only on the taste, the texture. The world was not hostile. It was just a world. The fear I had felt was a product of my own tired, worried mind. Here, in the warmth, with this perfect, sweet fruit, everything was calm again. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless thing. I was woken by a sound outside the bungalow. A soft, scraping noise, like a branch being dragged across the wooden wall. I lay perfectly still, my breath held tight in my chest. My muscles went rigid, my limbs locking in place. My ears strained against the night's chorus of insects and frogs trying to isolate the intrusive sound. The noise came again, closer to the door this time. A gentle scratching, then silence. A profound coldness spread from the center of my chest outwards, a creeping frost that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. My skin prickled with it, then the chill sank deeper into the marrow of my bones, making my teeth ache. I did not move for nearly an hour, my ears straining against the night's chorus of insects and frogs. I lay there in the dark, my hands balled into fists, clutching the thin cotton sheet. The silence after the scratching was an active, listening silence. It felt more menacing than the sound had. I could hear the frantic, muffled thumping of my own heart. I could hear the whisper-soft sound of the mosquito net moving in the faint breeze from the window. The air in the room was stale, tasting of my own anxious, recycled breath. Every creak of the bungalow settling, every skittering noise from the roof was the sound of the thing coming back. I thought of Stanley. I thought of him lost in the jungle, and a wave of cold washed over me so intense it made my teeth ache. I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, the name of a forgotten horror movie on the tip of my tongue. In the morning, the world seemed brighter, safer. The fear of the night felt foolish in the clear light of day. I opened the curtains, flooding the room with brilliant, warm sunlight. The birds were singing, a cheerful, chaotic sound. I felt a surge of relief, so potent it was almost giddy. A stray cat, a branch falling on the roof. Of course that's what it was. I was being ridiculous. I opened the door to the veranda, ready to dismiss the sounds, and stopped. On the top step, placed perfectly in the center, was a small woven banana leaf bowl. Inside were a few white frangipani flowers, a piece of ginger, and 3 sticks of incense unlit. The weaving of the leaf was intricate, a careful, patient work of hands. The flowers were impossibly white against the green. My first thought was a prickle of fear, a return of the night's chill. It was so personal, so deliberate. This was a message. The thing that had scratched at my door had left me a gift. But that was the thinking of a frightened child, of a mind steeped in horror movies. Monsters do not leave offerings. My second thought was that it was a warning from the villagers, the ones who had stared at me in the market. A sign to ward me away, a piece of folk magic I couldn't understand. But it didn't look menacing. It looked, in its own way, beautiful, which led to my final, most comforting thought. The guest house staff. Of course, they knew I was alone. They knew Stanley hadn't returned. They were worried about me. This was their way of showing concern, a local custom, a prayer for well-being and for Stanley's safe return. It was a bit strange to leave it on the doorstep without a word, but it was kind. Yes, that had to be it. It was a kind gesture from kind people, a sign of their hospitality, not a threat. I left the bowl where it was, not wanting to seem ungrateful. The scent of the ginger was sharp and clean in the morning air. The third day of Stanley's absence, a frantic energy took hold of me. I decided I had to organize. I would pack a small bag for him, for when he finally returned, tired and dirty. I would wash our clothes. I would bring order to the small space of the bungalow, and in doing so, bring order to my own spiraling thoughts. I went to the small porcelain sink to wash my face and hands. The cool water was a temporary relief from the oppressive heat, and the institutional smell of the bar soap was oddly comforting. As I was drying my hands on the thin, clean towel, I glanced down at my fingers. My wedding ring was there, a simple gold band, but next to it, where my grandmother's ring should have been, there was only pale, indented skin. The breath left my body in a rush. I checked the sink, the floor, the towels. Nothing. I never took that ring off. It was a part of my hand. My stomach plummeted. My hands flew to my neck, to the locket, a nervous, reflexive gesture. I began to search the bungalow, my movements becoming more and more frenzied. I stripped the bed, the sheets flying through the air. I pulled everything out of my suitcase, creating a chaotic pile of clothes on the floor. I checked the pockets of clothes I hadn't even worn. The ring was gone. It was a small thing, a simple band with a tiny sapphire, but it was my only connection to her, to my past. Tears of frustration pricked my eyes. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the room a chaotic mess around me. How could I have been so careless? My first thought was that it had been stolen. The scratching sound, the offering bowl. Someone had been in my room while I slept and had taken it. But the door had been bolted. Nothing else was missing. My wallet was still there. It made no sense. My second thought was that I had lost it down the drain. It was gone forever, washed away. But surely I would have heard the clink of metal on porcelain, the sound of it dropping into the pipe. I heard nothing. I forced myself to take a deep, shuddering breath. The humidity, my fingers had been swelling in the heat. That had to be it. I must have taken it off in my sleep unconsciously because it felt tight, or it slipped off while I was washing my hands. It was small. It could have rolled under the bed or into a corner of the room I hadn't checked properly. It was not gone forever. It was simply misplaced. Stanley would help me find it when he got back. He was always good at finding things. The thought was a small, solid anchor in a sea of panic. The ring was here, somewhere. I just had to be calm and logical. As dusk fell, I abandoned the search. The fading light made the corners of the room dark and indistinct, turning my scattered belongings into strange, menacing shapes. I sat on the veranda, the empty teacup for Stanley still on the small table beside me. The jungle, which had been a wall of green, was now a wall of shadow. The air grew still, the insects quieting in that brief, hushed moment between day and night. It was then that I heard it. Not a scrape this time, but a rustle in the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the light of my single porch bulb. I froze, my eyes fixed on the spot. The leaves of a large fern trembled, though there was no breeze. Then I saw it, a shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows. It was tall and unnervingly thin, a silhouette of a man, but stretched, elongated, as if seen in a distorted mirror. It moved with a slow, unnatural grace that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. My blood went to ice. The day's accumulated heat evaporated from my skin in an instant, leaving me pebbled with goosebumps. The cold wasn't just on my skin, it sank through me, a deep, penetrating chill that settled in my bones and made my joints ache. I could not scream. My throat had closed up, trapping the air in my lungs. I could not move. I could only watch as the shadow figure stood perfectly still, seeming to watch me back. I blinked, my eyes watering from the strain of staring, and it was gone. The ferns were still, the clearing was empty. My mind raced, scrambling for purchase, for any solid thought to cling to. My first hopeful thought was him, Stanley, back from the jungle, gaunt and exhausted. But that shape was not my husband. It was too tall, too thin, too fluid. The way it moved was wrong. My second thought was of ghosts, of the local spirits the guest house owner had spoken of in hushed tones, the guardians of the forbidden places. A preternatural terror seized me. It was a demon from the temple, and it had followed Stanley back. But that was madness. That was folklore and fear. My mind, desperate for order, produced the final, sane explanation. It was a trick of the light. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows. I was exhausted, stressed, and my imagination was running wild. It was a deer or a large monkey or even another person walking on a path I couldn't see. My eyes were tired. My mind was tired. I was projecting my fears onto the jungle. I scrambled back inside the bungalow and bolted the door, my entire body trembling. I leaned against the cool wood of the door, telling myself it was a logical reaction to a trick of the light. The bungalow was suddenly a haven. I turned on every light, chasing the shadows into the corners. The harsh, yellow glow from the bare bulbs felt like a shield. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, the cheap, synthetic fabric a source of artificial warmth. I sat on the bed and took deep breaths, the electric hum of the lights a steady, comforting presence. The shadow was nothing. The jungle was just the jungle. I was safe in my room. The fear began to recede, replaced by a feeling of exhausted foolishness. I began to feel that time itself was becoming unreliable. I had been keeping a diary, a simple travel journal Stanley had given me before we left. He'd said it was to capture the memories. Now it felt more like a lifeline, a way to prove the days were passing in an orderly fashion. I sat down to write about the shadow in the jungle, my hand shaking so much the letters were spiky and uneven. The pen felt slippery in my grip. When I finished the entry for the day, I dated it. Friday. I flipped back a page to reread what I had written the day before. The entry was for Thursday, describing the discovery of the offering bowl. But the page before that, the page that should have been Wednesday, was blank. A chasm opened in my mind. Wednesday was simply gone. I had no memory of it. I remembered Tuesday, our last morning together. I remembered Stanley leaving. I remembered the heat, the waiting. I remembered Thursday, finding the bowl. I remembered today, Friday, with its market trip and the shadow. But Wednesday was a perfect, silent void. I tried to recall what I had eaten, what I had worn, whether I had left the bungalow. Nothing came. It was as if the day had been neatly excised from my life, the page snipped out of a book. A feeling like cold water filled my veins. A whole day had vanished. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, as if the pressure could force a memory to the surface. There was only a dull ache behind my temples. My first terrifying thought was that I was losing my mind, a neurological event, a breakdown, a fugue state. I had lost a day because my brain was broken, but the thought was too horrifying to hold on to. A second thought emerged. Someone had drugged me. The food, the water, something had been tampered with, and I'd been unconscious, but my door was bolted. Nothing was disturbed, so I settled on the third most plausible explanation. I must have been ill. The stress, the heat, something I ate. I must have come down with a sudden high fever. I probably went to bed early on Tuesday evening feeling unwell and simply slept through the entirety of Wednesday, not waking until Thursday morning. It was a frightening loss of time, but it was a medical event, not a mental one. It was the only explanation that allowed me to feel sane. And yet, the blank page in my journal felt like a silent accusation. It felt like a piece of my mind had been carved out, and I was terrified of what might have filled the space. My interactions with the local people grew stranger, more unsettling. The woman who came to clean the bungalows, a young girl named Suni with a shy, beautiful smile, had always been a small point of light in my lonely days. We communicated with gestures and smiles. She would bring me fresh flowers for the small vase on my table. After the incident of the missing Wednesday, her demeanor changed. I saw her approaching the row of bungalows, and I stepped out onto my veranda, holding Stanley's photograph. It was a picture of him from our last anniversary, his face crinkled in a wide smile against the blurred background of a cheerful restaurant. The photo paper was glossy, and his smiling eyes seemed to catch the light. I called out, "Suni!" My own voice sounded strained, and then I held the photo out to her. "Have you seen my husband?" Her smile vanished. She stopped short, her eyes fixing on the photograph in my hand. The light seemed to go out of her face. Her whole body went rigid. The basket of clean linen she was carrying slipped from her grasp, scattering white sheets across the dusty path like fallen petals. A sound came from her throat, a small, choked gasp. Then she turned and ran. She did not look back. She just ran, her bare feet kicking up dust, her shoulders hunched as if fleeing some terrible beast. I heard her shouting something in Thai to the other workers as she disappeared around a bend. I stood on the veranda, the photograph still in my hand, Stanley's smiling face a cruel mockery. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful, frantic beat. My hand holding the picture was shaking. What had I done? I had only asked a question. My first thought was that she knew. She saw his face and knew he was dead, and her fear was of having to deliver the terrible news. But her reaction was not pity. It was terror. She was not afraid for me. She was afraid of me. My second thought was that the photograph itself was some kind of taboo, an offense I could not comprehend. Maybe it was forbidden to show images of those who had gone to the forbidden temple. But then my mind, always searching for a way to make it my own fault, settled on the final explanation. I had frightened her. My sudden appearance, my desperate tone, my looming, pale presence. I had cornered this shy, gentle girl and shoved a picture in her face. I was a monster of grief and worry, clumsy and scary. A wave of shame washed over me so potent it was almost a relief. It was my fault. I could understand my own fault. I knew I had to prove to myself that these were all misunderstandings, that the fear I felt was a fiction of my own making. I decided to retrace my steps, to conduct a small experiment. I would go back to the market. I would go to the same fruit stand where the mother had snatched her child away. I would buy some mangoes, smile, and act like a perfectly normal tourist. I would prove that the memory was distorted by my own anxiety. The walk to the market felt different. The air seemed thicker. The sounds of the jungle more subdued. The usual vibrant bird calls were absent, and a strange quiet hung over the path. The heat felt heavy and suffocating, not warm and alive. When I arrived, the usual morning bustle was in full swing. I located the stall, a splash of vibrant color with pyramids of rambutans and dragon fruit. The same old woman was there, her face a beautiful road map of wrinkles. She was handing a small bag of fruit to a customer. I took a deep breath, pasted a pleasant smile on my face, and stepped forward as the other customer walked away. The moment she saw me, the light in her eyes went out. Her hand, reaching for a mango, froze in midair. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at me, her gaze one of pure, undiluted terror. Then she did something that stopped my heart. She raised her hand, fingers splayed, and pushed it towards me, a gesture to ward off evil. It was a sign I had seen carved on temple doors, a protection against spirits. She scrambled backwards, knocking over a basket of bananas, their sweet scent mixing with the smell of dirt as they bruised on the ground. She began to jabber in a high, panicked voice, gesturing wildly at me. In moments, the space around her stall was empty. People didn't just move away, they fled. I was left standing in a sudden silent circle of abandonment, the smell of crushed, rotting fruit sharp in the air. I turned and walked back to the bungalow. I did not run. I walked with a slow, deliberate pace, as if balancing something fragile on my head. Each step was a small victory against the urge to collapse. My feet crunched on the gravel path. One foot, the other foot. The air tasted like copper. I focused on the horizon, not looking at the few faces I passed, faces that turned away in haste. When I reached the safety of my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, my body trembling uncontrollably. A coldness had taken root deep inside my chest, a core of ice that no tropical sun could ever melt. My eyes fell on the nightstand. Sitting there next to my book was the silver locket. But I was wearing it. My hand flew to my neck. The chain was there, but the locket itself was gone. I looked back at the nightstand. There it sat, gleaming dully in the dim light. It was coiled neatly, the chain in a perfect circle around the locket itself, as if placed there for display. It looked ancient and remote. I had no memory of taking it off. I remembered clutching the chain in the market, a nervous habit. The terror of my situation was making my memory fray at the edges. That was the first frantic thought. I was becoming so undone by stress that my own actions were a mystery to me. I must have been fumbling with the clasp in the market, unhooked it without noticing. Then, upon returning, my mind so numb with horror, I must have placed it on the table. The action was so automatic, so disconnected from my conscious thought that it left no trace. It was the only explanation that didn't involve ghosts or madness. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up. I fumbled with the clasp, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy. When I finally secured it around my neck, the metal was shockingly cold against my skin. It felt like a piece of ice resting on my collarbone. There was only one place left where I could find any kind of truth, any solid ground. My diary. It was the only witness I had. I decided I would read it from the very beginning of our trip, from the day we landed in the dizzying heat of Bangkok. I would reconstruct the timeline, event by event, and I would find the seams. I would find where my mind had started to play tricks on me. I made a cup of tea, my hands steady now with purpose. The simple ritual was calming. The boiling water, the fragrant steam, the warmth of the ceramic mug in my hands. This was order. This was logic. For a moment, sitting there, I felt sane and capable, an investigator about to solve a mystery. I sat in the wicker chair by the window and opened the journal. The first pages were filled with my neat, looping handwriting. They described the temples of the capital, the taste of street food, the feeling of the humid air on my skin. I wrote about Stanley, how his eyes lit up at the sight of a new kind of flower, how he charmed the hotel staff with his terrible butchered attempts at speaking Thai. Reading it, I could almost feel the warmth of those early days, the easy rhythm of our shared adventure. A lump formed in my throat, a painful swelling of loss. I continued to read, page after page. The entries became shorter, the descriptions of the outside world replaced by the landscape of my own waiting. I read about the market, about the offering bowl, about the shadow in the trees. My own rationalizations were there on the page, my careful explanations for every strange occurrence. They are just not used to foreigners. A kind gesture from the staff, a trick of the light. Seeing them written down, they seemed so flimsy, so desperate. I turned the page to the entry for Tuesday, the last day I had seen Stanley. My handwriting was tight, cramped. S. Went to the old temple. I asked him not to. A cold feeling in my stomach. That was all I had written. The next page was the blank one. The missing Wednesday. Or what I had thought was a blank page. It wasn't blank. It was filled with writing, but it was not my writing, not my neat, controlled script. This was a frantic scrawl. The pen dug so deep into the paper that it had torn through in places. The letters were jagged, violent, slanting across the page as if written in a moving vehicle. My breath caught in my throat. I held the page closer to the light. The paper itself felt different, rougher, as if it had been damp and then dried. I could smell a faint, earthy scent coming from it, like mud and wet leaves. The words were English, but they felt foreign, spat from the mouth of a stranger. Followed him, the first line read. He didn't listen, never listens. The scrawl described a frantic chase through the jungle, thorns tearing at skin, lungs burning. It described the ruins, stone teeth and a green mouth. Then the words became fractured, sound, rocks, a long way down. My hands started to tremble, the diary shaking with them. The spidery text continued, a testament from a part of my mind I had locked away. It described climbing down into a ravine. It described finding him. It described how his camera was smashed on a rock beside him. It described how quiet it was. The diary entry spoke of sitting with him for a long time, for hours, until the sun went down, until the moon came up. Then the story turned. It described the first villager to find them, a man with a torch. It described his scream, and then it described a scream in return, a sound torn from a raw throat. He tried to touch Stanley. I wouldn't let him. Threw a rock, hit him, he ran. They all ran. The final lines on the page were almost illegible, a mad scribble. They won't take him. He is mine. His ring is safe now. It's with mine. Safe. I stopped reading. The air in the room was thick and silent. I could hear nothing but the blood pounding in my ears. Slowly, as if moving through water, I lowered the diary and looked at my own hand. My left hand, on my ring finger, was my simple gold wedding band, and next to it, pushed up against it, was another, larger gold band, Stanley's. I had put his ring on my own finger and had not once, not for a single moment, been aware of it. The ring I thought I had lost, my grandmother's ring, was on my other hand, exactly where it had always been. My mind had simply edited it out, replacing it with the fiction of a loss, because the truth of the gain was too terrible to comprehend. My gaze drifted to my throat in the small, cracked mirror above the dresser. What? My hand came up. My fingers felt clumsy and strange. They fumbled with the clasp. It finally came undone. The locket fell into my palm. It felt cold and heavy. I looked at the silver flowers. The grooves were dark. Not with tarnish, but with a reddish-brown crust. It was dry and flaking. Dried blood. The bungalow fell away. The wicker chair was gone. The scent of frangipani vanished. It was all a story, a room I built. The truth was not here. The truth was cold stone. The sun was hot on my back. The air smelled of dust and fear. I was at Wat Tham. I was sitting at the edge of the ravine. The stones below were very far. The villagers were watching from the trees. Their faces were not afraid. They were filled with pity. The girl, Suni, stepped forward. She held out a bottle of water. Her eyes were sad. They looked past me. I was no longer there for them. I was a ghost in the sun. There was no ground left, only the long fall down.